6:30. I realize we probably have 20 seconds to go, but I'm presuming on your time, and this is truly a crash course in creation science. 6 sessions in 3 nights. It's not how I've ever heard that it's been done before, so this is an experiment to see if it works. But I realize that we are only laying the foundations for creation science. We don't have time to go as in-depth as maybe some of you would like to go. So perhaps, I was just talking with Dr. Don here and saying, you know, maybe we ought to think about doing a more in-depth seminar, get some more experts in. I know he's been involved with Answers in Genesis. My wife and I had an opportunity to be down there for the grand opening of the Ark, so you know this may be something we'd like to do again. But this is going to give us a good foundation on science versus creation science versus the Bible. Let's take a look at what we can learn. We should have sufficient groundwork at the end of this 6 weeks to be able to establish a good foundation in and establish faith in the Bible record as proven by the scientific studies of the day. And they're learning more. I don't know if you've been watching creation science now that we all have Google and everything else, but the amount of studies and the work that is coming out of scientists that support intelligent design is just absolutely amazing. So here's how we're going to operate. I hope you have your phones off. If you can't make a session and you actually would like to catch up on it, I did finally at the very last instant figure out how to get a YouTube live type of a thing where we'll be able to record them and put them on private. So if we aren't going to publish them out in the public, but if you want to see one of these, we can send the link to you and you can get on the YouTube and watch it again, or watch it if you have to miss one of the sessions. So other than that, there's water there. We'll take a break in between the 2 sessions, so it's 2 hours a night, and I'm really hoping we have an opportunity to raise a few questions, and that's where Dr. DeYoung, my resident expert, comes from. So he's also got some great books back there if you want to take a look at the book table, titles on science from the biblical and Christian perspective. I have a feeling I'll lose some money to Dr. DeYoung before this is over. Well, I won't lose it. I'll invest in it, Doctor. But I really appreciate his ability to be here. I'm going to invite Dr. DeYoung up to have an opening prayer for us. We're going to launch right into it, and I'm going to go as fast as I can. I hope you can listen fast or something like that. Don?
Well, good evening, folks. Yes, my name is Don DeYoung. Pastor Anderson and I both have a great interest in this area of Bible science, as many of you also. So this topic covers lots of areas, everything from rocks and minerals to dinosaurs to space, and we'll do what we can here this weekend. Hey, thanks for coming out. We know there's lots of choices on the weekend. Let me open our time with prayer. Dear Lord, we do just thank you for the freedom we have to gather in your name and study. This whole area encourages Bible study and study of your creation, and we thank you for this opportunity. Pray that you guide our thinking together. We ask for your wisdom so that we can rightly divide your word of truth, and also your fingerprints are all around us in nature. Just pray that you'll teach us and encourage us. So guide our time here tonight. I just thank you again for this opportunity. We pray in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, Pastor.
So we won't have an opportunity to look at every element of science. Dr. DeYoung's specialty was in physics. There are many in chemistry, earth science, geology. There's lots of different scientific paths, but they are all coming to the same conclusion, and that is intelligent design. So we hope the topics we cover will give you a little better understanding. So to start with, this was actually a seminar created by Dr. Dr. Stan Hudson, who started out in geology before becoming a Christian. And he was having some problems understanding some of the geological principles that they were giving absent a creator. And so he switched to religion and got an MDiv, eventually a Doctor of Ministry from Fuller Theological out in the West Coast. And he's put together this presentation for us to use. So he's going to introduce the topic with a video and give you the format for how we're going to be working.
Where did everything on planet Earth come from? How did life start? How did humankind begin their journey on planet Earth? Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Hudson. I want to welcome you to this 6-part series on the subject of origins. And we're going to be addressing those big questions of where everything came from. Those are the kind of questions that I was introduced to when I was a geology major back at UC Riverside way back in the day. I was introduced to the great world of rocks, fossils, and the theory of evolution as to how we got all those things. I wasn't completely happy with all the answers that I was hearing, and actually I was led into a new area, religious faith. Today we're going to give you some evidence on the subject of where we even have a debate on where everything came from. Why is there such divergent views if the science should support a single view? Partway through this presentation there will be another video in which I'll be joining you, and also other people that are scientists or religious leaders who will be addressing the topic of the day. That will be our format as we go through our series. Right now, we're going to turn things over to our local hosts, and again, we want to thank you very deeply for joining us on this journey as we take a look at the great questions of where everything came from.
Can you hear that clear enough? Okay, just wanted to make sure because I thought it was, from the way I was trying to set it up, it was a little garbled earlier, so I wanted to make sure it was going to be clear enough because the longer video in the middle there, you're going to want to be able to hear what they have to say. And I know it is a controversial topic for some people. I think we are fortunate to live in a community where there's a little less controversy than there is on some. But the presentations are going to draw from a couple of different models. And especially we're going to take a look at the science and the scripture that will substantiate the creation model. We're going to differentiate those models as we go along and explain the history and the cultural roots that undergird each one. All of us know that we have certain prejudices that we seem to be raised with. Our parents do things a certain way. Sometimes they teach us a certain way. And we can end up viewing the rest of the world as a result of how Mom and Dad told us we should. And so tonight we're going to be talking about the origin of the debate that actually got started here and how many people have noticed that there is tension between the subject of origins and where everything came from. It seems that science and religion at times are combating each other. We don't think it should be that way. But if we can understand where the both sides come from and the worldview that impacts how they see things, perhaps we could better understand even the people we don't agree with. So the subject has often inspired people to take an active role, even putting bumper stickers out. You've probably seen these ones. And there have been a number of polls in the United States over time asking people how they felt about their origins. Where did you come from? The difference between 2017 and 19 I found was only about 1%, so it wasn't off much. This was the one that was on the slide that the doctor created. If you have your handout book, where there's going to be places to follow along in this, and this will start with the first 5 reasons for having an opinion on how to evaluate your worldview. Does everyone have one of the booklets? If you didn't get a booklet, raise your hand. We have someone will hand you a booklet. If you need a pencil, let me know. So there's 3 options that are given in this poll that the Gallup organization did. One on the left would be a recent creation. That's what I believe, but not everybody does. The one in the far right says that everything just came about as a result of natural causes, and the one in the center would be a combination of both. So you would have a theistic evolution. There was a God, but God used evolution. So in 2017, 38% believed in a recent creation, 38% believed in a theistic creation, and 19% believed in natural evolution. That does not add up to 5 or 100%, and that's because I guess some people don't really have an opinion. I've never met anyone like that, but that may be true. You can see the differences were fairly substantial, but it does appear, especially here in America, that there is a significant number of people who still feel quite strongly about God. There is a religious source in most people's worldviews. So let's take a look now at how the science will actually be measured. So the word science comes from the word scientia. Is that correct? Did I say that right? Okay, scientia. Sometimes it's not quite the way it's spelled, which means knowledge, and it's a system of acquiring knowledge based on what's called the scientific method, for those of you who remember high school chemistry, as well as an organized body of knowledge gained through such research. But it's helpful to notice that you can divide the definition of science into two separate parts. First, there is hard science. Hard science is the kind that we do in a laboratory. It's testable knowledge. It can be reproduced, predicted, something that can be observed. Hard science is sometimes interpreted using current models and sometimes using other worldviews. So you see that sometimes people come up with different reasons and different answers, even though they've all used the same statistics. I don't suppose you've ever seen that happen in culture and society today, but it seems that a lot of people have different views, even when the facts stay the same. The other one that we would have for science is historical science. Now, this is not testable knowledge, nor is it something that can be predicted or observed. Historical science is the story behind trying to explain the past based on current processes and observations, but it's not repeatable. So for instance, if you believe in a Big Bang theory, you can't repeat the Big Bang. So you take current observations and you go back and endeavor to make a model that will allow for what the science appears to have told us. So let's give an example of what historians might be able to do with some statistics. Pilgrims came to the Americas in the 1600s, and what were they seeking? So you could say, I suppose, that they were coming to America because they had heard Native Americans had lots of land, and they were hoping to take some land away from the Native Americans. Or it could be something more like the Pilgrim story, that they were trying to leave Europe and get away from religious persecution. So it could really depend upon your worldview as to what you would make out of the statistics. Sometimes we hear people going back and looking at history and they want to tell the story in a different manner. And they come up with another way of describing what was actually taking place. So the historian's answer may actually tell us more about the historian than it does about the pilgrims. So if facts are facts, why don't we all agree on everything? Well, I guess it's just difficult to do that. I suspect in America, not everybody is a Republican. I suspect not everyone's a Democrat. For some reason, everybody looks at the same country and they all come up with a different opinion on how they think things should be. One of the things that I've noticed is whatever my opinion is the one that I'm certain is right. You may have come to that same conclusion with all of your opinions. But one of the things that we all need to remember is something that's very rarely understood or taught, There is data, there are hard numbers, and then there's the interpretation of that data. Making sense of the data that you're looking at. Data does not equal interpretation. Those are two distinct and different things. Interpretation is always open for review. Hard science equals data. Historical science equals the story that we've come to believe on why that data is true. And here the subject of a worldview becomes critical. Now what I'm going to go over here in the next couple minutes in the worldview, you'll find this on page 2 in your handout if you want to take a look at those questions. Because as we recognize what our worldview is, we're going to see how it shades the way we take a look at facts. So let's get a closer look at this subject of a worldview. What is it? Everybody has one, believe it or not, even if you don't think you do. It is the faith framework that we use to interpret or make sense of our world. Whether you have faith in a God or no faith at all, it is the way you view the way the world works. And it's formulated by where and when we came from. I was originally born in Canada, moved to the United States in 1960, so you can tell I've been here a long time, became a U.S. citizen. And, but you know, some of those Canadian thoughts just never leave your head. You still like hockey. Imagine that. So here's 5 questions that we need to answer. First, what is your supreme authority? In other words, where is the place that you will go to help you understand something with a final answer? Remember that game show, Is That Your Final Answer? Well, that's where we go. Who is the one that will give us the best authoritative understanding of what we're looking at when we're looking at data? And it could be science, it could be God, it could be many things, and it could be combinations of any of those things. The second thing that makes up a worldview is, where did everything come from? That's what origins are. That's what we're going to be looking at in these next 3 nights. The third thing is, what is your place in the world? And that can seem like a very easy topic to discuss, but believe it or not, not everybody has the same view of who they are and what their position in the world is. The fourth thing would be, what is your moral code? Moral codes can be difficult to define sometimes. Matter of fact, situation ethics and some of those sorts of discussions can quickly show where there is dispute and disagreement. But what is right? What is wrong? Where do you find who the good guys are? How do you know who the bad guys are? And your moral code will help you identify that. And then the fifth question is, what is your future? Are you going anywhere after you die? Well, that's very important to know too, and all of these things will contribute to what a worldview is. So now here's an example of a worldview that clearly interprets data. So if you go out to, if you go out to the John Day Fossil Beds National Monument in Oregon, you'll see some marvelously preserved fossil beds full of mostly mammal fossils. Now, when these fossils were first studied and written about and promoted in the 1800s, greatly increasing the nation's understanding of life, it was by Oregon's first paleontologist. Believe it or not, he was a Christian pastor. His name was Thomas Condon, and this is what he wrote about the fossil layers that he saw. The hills from which these evidences were taken, he wrote, in reference to the evolutionary record of the fossil beds, were made by the same God who made the hills of Judea, and the evidences are as authoritative. And then he added, the church has nothing to fear from the uncovering of the truth. And he also said that evolution was simply God's method of working, and therefore was not atheistic or infidel. obviously, he understood the biblical account a little bit different from how I do, and maybe some of you do. He certainly wasn't that concerned about the flood or any of the evidence that might be there as a result of that. So we might reasonably ask, what was Thomas Condon's supreme authority? That's the first question we asked under a worldview, and it appears that even though he was a pastor, his supreme authority was the popular science of the day. Our worldview then helps us to interpret lots of things. Our understanding of suffering and wars, where we came from. It'll be helpful in our understanding of science and faith. Our worldview informs us of what we ultimately believe about the origin of the earth. Perhaps even some of the intricacies of which came first, as well as what we believe about that great question of pain and suffering in the world today. So if I was to ask you, do you have a place in your worldview for God? What would you say? And if so, what does he look like? You may find that there are people who have differing views of who God is. There are people who look at God as being a little vindictive at times. Others who only see him as a God of love. Some see him as a God of justice. It could change how you view the beginnings and origins if your worldview is different from somebody else's. So in 1998, a poll was taken of the members of the National Academy of... Excuse me, I'm just going to move this a little. I get better access to my clicker. National Academy of Sciences. And these are the people who are responsible for putting together the curriculums that are studied in our schools. And a poll was taken about their beliefs. It revealed their worldviews significantly. They were asked, do you believe in a personal God? And you can see that only 7% believed in a personal God. They were also asked about disbelief in a personal God. That is, are you certain that he doesn't exist? And the answer was a full 72% who did not believe in a personal God. 21% had doubts and didn't particularly want to make a final statement, so a full 93% of these thought leaders and scientists, the article that was written about this research was called "Leading Scientists Still Reject God." And it was true that 93% of them still rejected God. It's logical to assume that their worldview would influence the approach they took to origins, and it would clearly impact the curriculum of what kids study. Ironically, Western science had its roots in a different worldview. People were motivated to study the works of nature as the works of a creator God. That was the primary view for most of the period after what we would call CE. What is that? Current Common Era. Thank you. Yeah, I'm still in AD. So I do BC and AD. I don't do good with those. But CE, you're right. Most of the time, matter of fact, Sir Isaac Newton, I don't know if you knew this, he wrote more on the Bible than he did on physics and mathematics. So he was quite a student of Scripture. Initially, that was the view that all scientists took coming out of the early ages of university. And here's what Newton said: no sciences are better attested than the religion of the Bible. He saw no conflict between believing in a creator, and he saw no conflict in how everything we see in nature came to be. So where and when did this change take place? So back around the 1200s in universities in Europe, like Cambridge here, or some of the other colleges, they only taught that God had created the world like the Bible said, and for centuries, all the graduates tended to think the same as their professors. You can see where their worldview was coming from. However, in the last couple hundred years, today's universities in the West only teach that nature, material, created and organized everything that we see. In other words, nature has been deified and personified to become really the one who tells the story of science. So now almost all graduates tend to think the same as their professors. Not surprising, is it? Except, of course, when we do have some wonderful colleges like Grace University here that have scientists that have a different worldview. But in a broader world, we're still seeing that these worldviews are shaping the type of science that gets accomplished. Science operates using models. We sometimes call them theories, but they're really just operational models, and they can be very difficult to change. They're meant to help us understand what we see. And a pioneer in the subject was a Harvard physicist named Thomas Kuhn in the mid-1900s. He wanted to understand how the models change in science. Is it possible to change your view on how these models work? For example, he wanted to find out how Aristotle went about his research and understanding of nature. And he wanted to get into Aristotle's mind and see how he would possibly have concluded some of the things that he had concluded. And it took a while, but eventually he arrived there. And so then he came to the next logical question, and this is the one that we want to talk about. Somewhere, the serious change took place in a model from the time of Aristotle to the time of the industrial revolutions and the cultural revolutions, the educational and scientific revolutions that took place. What made those differences? So he came up with this concept, which you're probably quite familiar with, a paradigm, a way of viewing the data, and a paradigm shift. It's very hard for scientists, like everybody else, to shift their paradigms and their models once they've become established. And once we have placed all of our education underneath this one way of looking at things. But Dr. Kuhn realized that rethinking about some of these models was going to become important in really understanding all of the science that was being fed our direction. So let's just take a quick example here of a way of looking at what a model might look like. Most of us remember from our history books that there was at one time in almost every kingdom an alchemist. Alchemy was actually considered a science. It was the predecessor to chemistry. And for many centuries, a lot of kings kept somebody on their payroll to actually do this. Their primary purpose, of course, as we recall, was they were hoping they could change lead into gold. Lead was heavy, gold was heavy. They figured this should be something you would be able to do with the right type of science, even if they called it something else. Gold is soft, lead is soft. Lead is bad, gold is good. So they did a lot of work trying to change lead into gold, but they really couldn't make it happen. But that changed the way some people thought about science. Here's another model you might consider. Most of us would think this is an electric light bulb, but perhaps it isn't. Perhaps if you have a different worldview, you might think it's a dark sucker. As soon as you turn on the switch, the bulb sucks all the dark out and fills it into the bulb, and so everything else looks very light. Well, darkness is completely in that bulb right now. That's how you can tell that it's light in here. It's very successful. Now, you could say that it explains something. I also heard one person trying to explain about dropping something, paper wads, on the ground, and they were being pushed to the ground by invisible little green men. You maybe have heard of that experiment. Every time they tried it, the little balls of paper ended up on the ground, and it was clear evidence that little green men had been pushing them down. If you have the wrong worldview, you could come up with the wrong answer from the scientific data. So models on the subjects of origin and how natures operate are very critical, especially when the subject of whether or not there is a God becomes involved. Here's a comment by Richard Lewontin, a Harvard biologist. He says, "We have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Now, materialism in this sense is not Mercedes-Benz or all the things that you have, sometimes under the terms that we would think of it today, but materialism in science would be the idea that material is all there is, just the stuff that makes up the world. So having an unseen force, believing in intelligent design or the possibilities of a God or a creator, just doesn't seem to fit in a worldview or a paradigm where they are going to stick to their model and not allow anything else to interfere. Richard Dawkins, the world-famous atheist, biologist in Oxford, said, "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." You can clearly see how scientists will agree that things we look at seem to suggest that they were designed. There's a complexity to it and a purpose. But if your worldview or your paradigm does not allow that, you have to come up with some other solution or some other answer. Some series of fortunate accidents, as we've seen in some of our science classes. Most of my experiments were unfortunate accidents. In chemistry class, yes. But rather evolve. Now, when you have that kind of a commitment to not allowing a divine foot in the door, this worldview will absolutely affect the way you interpret data. But the human mind is such that when we look at some objects like these rock formations, we understand that there are certain random forces like the wind, rain, earthquakes, whatever, that may shape what we end up looking at. And so we know that depending on how hard a stone is or something like that, it could be transformed or changed based on the weather conditions. But when we look at something like this, then we say, can random forces really make this? And it becomes a little bit more complicated when we see a design to the structure. When we talk about the subject of origins, it is hard to miss the greatest and most fundamental of all scientific questions, and that is this: how did life appear? Where did life come from? Good question. When you talk about life, there's a wide variety of understanding of even what life is. Here's a definition from Webster's. I know it falls short, but I think it was the best they could do. A principle or force that is considered to underlie the distinctive quality of animate beings characterized by a capacity for metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. So how does that hit you? Does it adequately describe what life is? If you ask me, I would find it a little underwhelming, not overwhelming. And there is currently no consensus even regarding the definition of life. That comes from one of those great sources of information, Wikipedia. I'm sure somebody actually looked that up. There's many, even of several of the forms of life, so it's not just human life. So we do have to take a look at different models, perhaps, for different life. Plants, fungus, bacteria. It's clearly not what I am. Animals. Perhaps how did life arise from inorganic matter? And the answer to that question remains a great unknown in science. Did life come from outer space? You've probably been hearing a lot more of that. There's been some recent testings of rock elements that had elements of meteorites in them. Some people thought perhaps little aliens may have come to this Earth, or some asteroid that had life on it crashed into the Earth and it got everything started. There was one view back in the old days, if you remember from elementary biology class, Louis Pasteur, the famous French biologist, was tackling the subject of where life came from, and he came up with a theory that was known as spontaneous generation. That life just simply appeared from time to time in different places, and he conducted a series of experiments, and he came to this conclusion. There is no known circumstance in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, without parents, similar to themselves. This disproved the popular theories of spontaneous generation. And that led to the framing of the current biological law of biogenesis. That is, living things only come from other living things. I know they've made some experiments sometimes trying very hard to create in the labs. However, today modern scientists generally believe something very different. Nearly all scientists believe in abiogenesis. That is, life came about via natural chemical processes. From a hot chemical vent in a pool or some other water source, and so they would disagree with Pasteur's law. Now that is most secular scientists. And the law is something provable, whereas they're talking about historical science here. Remember the difference between hard science and historical science. What they're trying to imagine is something that took place in the past, even though they can't replicate it in a lab. They did try to mimic at one time, remember, because it's abiogenesis that happened, it was because of chemistry, long before there was any biology involved. And so there was an attempt to create life using chemistry. And the Stanley Miller-Urey experiments in 1952 were an attempt to recreate an environment of what they imagined Earth's early atmosphere was like. It involved gases, common chemicals, water, electricity, lightning. And it did create some simple amino acids. And so for a while, this was heralded as, see, this could have happened, and some kind of primordial soup somewhere may have had life spring up in it, and then evolution would take its course over the millions and billions of years. But the original conditions are now thought to be quite different, including the very early atmosphere. So, how did the basic chemicals present on Earth spontaneously arrange themselves into something resembling life? How did we get DNA? What did the first cells look like? More than half a century after chemist Stanley Miller proposed his primordial soup theory, we still can't agree about what happened. Perhaps primordial soup that might have had bubbles in it, and these bubbles were the beginning of cells. Maybe. Cells are rather interesting. If you go back to 1665, if you remember your science history, there was someone named Robert Hooke who first looked through a microscope, and he began to see things he'd never seen before. Cells, rather rudimentary, but he could see cells, and they reminded him of a monastery cell. And so he named them cells. By Darwin's day, it was thought that these rooms or cells contained mostly something called protoplasm. Those are words we don't hear anymore. It was some kind of a jelly-like substance that filled up these cells. And then, of course, life was just a bunch of these cells with protoplasm in it. Well, things are a little bit different today. Biologist Michael Behe has pointed out, now it's the turn of fundamental science of life, modern biochemistry, to disturb. The simplicity that was once expected to be the foundation of life has proven to be a phantom instead. Instead, there are systems of horrendous, irreducible complexity that inhabit the cell. We could spend a lot of time talking about the complex nature of what's inside just a single cell, but that is not one of the things we're going to try to do during this seminar, maybe for some future event. You know, there is over 40 trillion cells in our bodies with 200 different types of functions. So we're talking about big-time complexity. And if there's a pothole that science usually runs into it and almost never misses, it's assuming things are a lot simpler than they really are. And that makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, because the simpler things could potentially be the easiest way to explain how we had all of these random forces create something more complicated. However, we don't see a lot of simplicity in nature. Instead, we actually see complexity. Remember that the first model of alchemy was to try to turn lead into gold. Rather simple task, you might think. But it wasn't such a simple process. They assumed wrong. And there is great complexity in nature. So going back to the day when Darwin arose with his theory of survival of the fittest and the origin of species, it just happened historically to be a perfect storm, you might say, for evolution to arise in the mid-19th century. So let's take a look at what some of those factors were. First of all, in the science communities and in the universities, the Bible standing was beginning to be weakened by something called higher criticism. You may hear that term still. Many people who believe they're very educated look at a book like the Bible and say, you know, this was a bunch of random people that somebody garnered all of their writings, pulled them all together. How can you be certain there's any God or there's any real rhyme or reason to how the book came about? And they began to question whether or not there could even be a divine being. And a second factor was they began to discover some key fossils. Archaeopteryx, dinosaurs, Neanderthal. For instance, the Archaeopteryx, which was the famous bird lizard-looking fossil found in Germany. It looked like a bird. It had features like a lizard, long bony tail, claws on its wings, teeth in its beak. It sure looked like it was perhaps at one time a dinosaur or a lizard and was in the process of changing into a bird. So as a result of their observations, they began to think that something other than what the Bible story told was actually true. And then there was the Neanderthal man that they also discovered in Germany, one of the first cavemen. It seemed like maybe this was the guy Darwin was onto something. The third factor is that there was ignorance about the complexity of genetics. Now, we have come a long ways. I can remember early in my education, I'm sure Dr. DeYoung does too, when they were first describing DNA to us and RNA and things like that. We were so totally amazed. Nobody had ever thought about decoding the genome or encoding the genome. These were just way beyond anything that we could imagine. Things just get more complicated instead of less complicated. So the idea of cells with protoplasm in it, well, that just wasn't holding up anymore. And finally, there was a growing belief that the world was perhaps 1 million years old. And that the story of a 5,000, 6,000, maybe even 10,000 year planet just didn't seem to make sense to anybody. And so one of these geologists, Charles Lyell, began to imagine that the world was at least 2 million years old. And this would now give some credibility to some of these evolutionists coming up with ideas that if you had sufficient time, you could get a lot of changes taking place in nature. Charles Darwin's contribution to the field, of course, we remember his book and his visit to the Galapagos Islands. Believe it or not, he graduated from Cambridge University as a religion major. Matter of fact, his wife prayed for him until her death that he would at some point convert. He didn't. And he became the first naturalist on the HMS Beagle that set out to do a map-making tour of the world in 1831. He got back in 36. But on the cruise, he made a lot of observations, as you may recall. And some of those observations began to change how he viewed the way different species came about. And so in 1859, his original work, The Origin of Species, came out. So what did he see? Well, he went to the Galapagos Islands, and that's the picture you see here. The Beagle crew went onto the island and was buying tortoises to make soup, turtle soup, I guess, or at least to eat them. And they began to notice that the different shapes of these tortoise shells, the locals could tell them which island they came from. And that set Darwin to thinking maybe there was a common ancestor somewhere, and then they each developed according to the weather conditions or where they were living. He also collected a bunch of bird samples, and he took them all back to England because he wasn't much of an ornithologist, and he said, look at all these different birds that I found, and when they told him that all the different birds, regardless of their beaks, were all finches, then he began to think, well, certainly these must have come from a common ancestor, and then they evolved. And all of this led him to come up with the theory that we know so well as the survival of the fittest. So what he saw was just a natural process by which organisms best adjusted to their environment and were most successful in surviving and reproducing. And from this observation, he proposed a net evolution, or what we would now call macroevolution, which is a large-scale, permanent change that results in the formation of higher taxonomic groups, or in other words, a lot of different critters. So if you have enough time, if there's enough changes that take place, why, anything could possibly happen. So when Darwin grew up in England, they were doing a lot of breeding of dogs for very special purposes, other animal husbandry. This was unnatural selection, but they knew what kind of traits they were trying to get as they bred these different animals, and so he felt that if nature had its course, where people were not interfering, why, it would be an origin of species by means of natural selection. So nature would just naturally select the best qualities, they would become the survivors, and that was the definition of how evolution worked. And it was broadly accepted. Not initially, but it became to grow over time. It takes time for some of these to really take root. However, since the survival of the fittest, it didn't change any genetic code of the living things. All it really does is make a species more fit. A new theory has emerged that does change the genetic code, and that was by mutations. And so they felt that if you had mutations within that changed the genetic code, then that would create a better theory on how evolution worked. There was only one problem with that, and that is that mutations don't actually make better animals. It actually makes them worse. Dennis Noble, a physiologist and evolutionist from Oxford, said this: all central assumptions of the modern synthesis, also called neo-Darwinism, have now been disproved. In other words, everything that you could do in a lab could not support the theory of evolution. So at this point, biologists were starting to get into trouble. And they had to come up with other ways trying to explain this. One of my favorite authors, I don't know how many others have listened to Stephen Mayer, but I enjoy his interviews that he has done with Pierce Morgan and some of these others, and he said this: the technical literature in biology is now replete with world-class biologists routinely expressing doubts about the various aspects of neo-Darwinian theory. Rarely has there been such great disparity between the popular perceptions of a theory and its actual standing in the relevant peer-reviewed scientific literature. So the idea that Darwin's theory, which once seemed so solid, has now really taken a back place. They're back to the drawing board, trying to look at what might be the best way forward. I want you to listen now to this video here in the middle of a number of experts who are looking at origins and the most recent discoveries.
Bereshit bara Elohim hashemayim v'haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And pretty much for centuries, through the Middle Ages, that was the single thought that people had about where origins came from. But then, toward the 1800s, the age of reason that it is called now by science, the thought that maybe there was not an active God out there. Maybe the laws of nature was all that was in operation. So the skepticism grew about the biblical account. Charles Darwin was taught in a university, Cambridge University, that had this skepticism. And pretty soon the worldview about where we came from dramatically changed. Today we still have this debate going between creationists and evolutionists. And let's now take a look at the origin of this great debate. To understand this, we need to go back to where science came from. It was a revolutionary new way of understanding our world. And what it did was it said, we're not going to bring all of our preconceptions into this. We're not going to let philosophers like Aristotle or somebody else tell us how the world works. What we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the world. We're going to use our empirical senses. That's our eyes, ears, sense of touch, those sorts of things. And those data that we collect, using those senses, we will interpret in a logical way. And that was a very powerful tool then for figuring out what's going on in the world. But then some people added an additional rule called methodological naturalism. It said not just that we should logically interpret data and that data will drive our theories. It said those theories may not ever come to the conclusion that God was involved in any way. It can only be naturalistic explanations that we can come up with.
The idea of natural selection actually was kind of around in those days when Darwin was developing his theory. Other people, in fact, had proposed essentially the same thing, but nobody had developed it in detail and with lined up arguments and evidence and made a case for it. So Darwin collected these ideas, and he credits reading Malthus on population over population and the competition for resources, and he was thinking about nature as a kind of a competition between different organisms, and then you realize there's more organisms than there are resources, so naturally those who are stronger would get the resources and survive. He played off that actually an inevitable conclusion. It's self-evident that if you have limited resources, the stronger are going to succeed better than the weaker. But Darwin's real strength, I think, was in developing a series of arguments that rested on evidence that, in fact, this kind of thing does happen in nature.
Well, I would say Darwin is certainly an icon in science. He's respected, and his contribution is perceived as really world-changing in some respects. So he is one of the holy saints of science, at the same level as Newton or other very important figure, Galileo Galilei. Now, when it comes to the mechanisms that Darwin suggested in terms of what could bring change in species or what could originate new species, when we begin to look at the granular level of the theory that he proposed, that might not be as popular nowadays. Why? Because we have so much more understanding of the complexity of life and understanding of basic things like the DNA, for example, that was not common knowledge at the time of Darwin. So he could envisage a much simpler way, in a sense, or a broad sketch of what he thought could happen, but he didn't have a clue of what was actually happening inside the cells.
Today, Darwin's views are somewhat under scrutiny, but it would be helpful, I think, to kind of dissect apart his views. One of his views was naturalism, and that view is under challenge. There's evidence, maybe there's gaps in nature, that there must be some kind of power involved. And of course, the intelligent design movement has used that and developed that argument that in fact there is something more than just nature. Another view of Darwin is that natural selection can account for varieties that adapt to local habitats. And I think virtually everybody accepts that. Then Darwin's view that microevolution, if you want to call it that, this natural selection of small changes, that accumulates over time to eventually produce macroevolution. Well, scientists have held to that very strongly because they were afraid to give creationists any kind of a foothold. But as time has gone on, the scientific community has kind of gotten wary of that argument, saying, no, we don't see this is going to work. For example, if it's advantageous to have a longer tail, well, you can get that tail longer and longer and longer, but you're never going to make a wing out of it. How do you get a new organ? Microevolution just is not going to add up to a new organ. Plus, looking at the fossil record, you do not see that in any way. Looking at modern experiments, you do not see that in any way. It just doesn't work. So at the present time, the scientific community, the evolutionary biology community, is looking for ways to explain macroevolution. So far they haven't found one, but there's many of them that recognize that Darwin's theory doesn't cut it. Another aspect of Darwin's theory is common ancestry. And I think for the most part, common ancestry is still accepted without empirical evidence, I would say, but as a necessary conclusion from materialism. If you're going to have only natural processes, you're not going to have different kinds of animals popping into existence all over the place. You're lucky to have it once. And so if you have it once, then maybe you can play with it from then on. But common ancestry is what I think is weakly supported, but it's necessary for naturalism.
The people who are molecular biologists and who are experts in the field of how genes act and how they function and whether or not genes get duplicated and what bacteria do with extra DNA if they encounter it, those guys are often working on particular problems. They're trying to solve cancer. They're trying to come up with a way of dealing with COVID. They're trying to solve a particular problem. And then we have another group of people over here who are trying to show that evolution is true. And they'll hypothesize about things that happen with DNA, these massive gene duplications that then resulted in new functions. but they never actually check their hypotheses with the people who actually know what they're talking about in terms of molecular biology. So there's often not a whole lot of crossover in between those fields, the theoretical evolutionary biologists and then the ones who actually are where the rubber meets the road. So I think sometimes hypotheses get generated about how these processes could have taken place. They're not necessarily in line with what even evolutionary molecular biologists would have to say. So there's sometimes a disconnect there. So that's the main way. They just ignore it often. The people who are working in problem-solving areas, well, evolution obviously took place. Have you thought about it? No, I'm busy trying to solve cancer. These guys down here, evolution obviously took place. Well, have you thought about it? Yes, I'm thinking about it very carefully. I think that this happened and this happened. Well, but that can't happen. Well, don't persuade me with facts, ma'am. So sometimes there's a lot of what are called in the literature just so stories, that this must have happened this way. Do we have any proof? I mean, maybe, but there's no, it happened in the laboratory.
Worldview kind of like glasses. That's one of my favorite illustrations. But the glasses, everyone has a pair. Some people aren't as aware of their worldview as others, but basically it's the lenses through which we interpret life. Worldviews are really helpful in what we would use them to answer the big questions. Does God exist? Does he or doesn't he? However you answer that question determines a whole lot of direction of where you're going to go. Where did the world come from? What does it mean to be human? Is there life after death? Ethics. Why are some things right or wrong? And then maybe another question might be, is there a grand overarching story that gives meaning to existence or not?
So what we think on the subject of origins is entirely shaped by our worldview. And does your worldview include a picture of a large and powerful and caring and capable God? Is he able to give us a record of what's taken place at the beginning? Does he care enough to think we actually would like to have that record? All of these things affect how we view the data, how we interpret the data through the filter of our worldview. Let's begin to take a look a little bit more now about some of the positive images that Scripture holds about the God who created us.
I can see I need to talk faster. So let's take a look at what the Bible says. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. The Bible's got a clearly different viewpoint than what many scientists do. I don't know if you remember this story. Back when the Apostle Paul came to Athens, it was a city of high intellectual achievement. A lot of philosophers there. It was a cross-section of people and cultures from all over the globe. And so while Paul was waiting there for some friends of his at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. So they worshipped all kinds of gods, all kinds of different temples. There was Epicureans, Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" The gods are not involved in the world, Paul said. Epicurus. The Epicurus said. The gods are not involved in the world. They're too busy having fun. Mankind should, don't worry and be happy. Kind of like a song someone once wrote. And they also believed there wasn't any afterlife. So really all you had to do was to take care of the business at hand. Stoic philosophers were also following Zeno, a different philosopher. He said God is in nature, not above it. Man's happiness comes from overcoming wrong attitudes through increased knowledge. And so if there was no afterlife, all you had was right now. Live as hard as you can. And others said, about Paul. He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. I got ahead of myself, didn't I? Yeah, and the resurrection. And when they mentioned the resurrection, this created quite a stir because they didn't believe in the afterlife. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and said, let us know what this new doctrine is of which you're speaking. Now, Paul was a very educated man, able to hold a spellbound crowd a lot better than I can. And he stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive in all things that you're very religious, for as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription that said to the unknown God, the one whom you worship, without knowing him, I proclaim to you. Of all of the gods that they had none like this. And Paul said, this is God who made the world, everything in it. He is the Lord of heaven and earth, doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art or man's devising. Now, Paul continued by saying, there were times of ignorance and God overlooked those. When men learn, they need to repent, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. There was the concrete evidence in Paul's mind. But when they heard resurrection of the dead, some mocked. These were science-oriented people, much like much of the world today, really. A being who made heaven and earth, a creator who gives actively and maintains the life of his creatures, someone who cannot be contained in temples or properly represented by art, a divinity above natural law and fully capable of suspending them at will, a God to whom we are responsible. This was different, but some believed. And they went through what we would call a paradigm shift, a change of their worldview. Alistair McGrath wrote this about Richard Dawkins. He said, although I passionately and totally was persuaded of the truth and the relevance of atheism as a young man, I subsequently found myself persuaded that Christianity was a much more interesting and intellectual and exciting worldview than atheism. And probably, if anyone is responsible for getting a man on the moon, it would have been the head of NASA back in the 80s and 90s and 70s. Dr. von Braun said, oops, I missed one here. Werner von Braun said, religion and science are sisters, and the one who seeks the knowledge of creation and the other of the Creator. So yes, we have good science and we have good news. And we're going to take a break, and I'll try to speak faster so we keep you on time. We're going to take a look at the origin of humans next. How did man come into existence? Let's take a break. Okay, I think we got most everybody in here. Let's just move along here. I'm going to try to, and I may cut a couple of slides short because I've been through this a few times trying to get it ready. And if it looks like we can make a little progress, so I can get you out of here at a reasonable hour, I don't want to keep you too late. So let's go ahead and get moving.
Talk about the subject of origins. Probably where the rubber meets the road is the biggest question of where mankind came from. Historically, when Neanderthal was discovered in the mid-1800s, it totally changed mankind's perceptions of where he may have come from. We have found fossils since then of potential ancestors to the human race. Where do we stand today in our understanding of where mankind came from? I'm now going to hand over to our local host this subject. Again, thank you for coming to the series on origins.
page 7 in your little handbook there, if you're following along. So let's take a look here at maybe your family. How does the family tree grow? Genealogy, that's been very popular recently. One of my family members went to Europe and did a study back on Grandma and found out that Grandma's direct ancestor was one of Martin Luther's students. So we got all excited about that, especially when we found out Grandma would have been considered Jewish. So we said, wow, how about that? We didn't know. They came from Denmark, so now we suddenly find all sorts of neat stuff. So how many of you have gone through and actually taken a look at your family and seen whether the roots of your family leave you with some resemblances? I've been amazed at some pictures that I've seen of people, great-great-grandparents and then great-great-grandchildren at the same age, and they look like twins. It's amazing, isn't it, how genetics get passed along? But I mean, here was a different view. Some people thought we were actually, instead of a royal sculpture, we actually came from a family that looked like this. And I can remember all the jokes in high school when we said, yeah, we know people like that. But there's two basic opinions, and either mankind was created or we emerged from that primordial soup we were talking about last time and became humankind through, I guess, what you would call a series of fortunate accidents or some sort of changes that was better known as evolution. And this image came out in 1965 in a Time Life book about human origins, and the book featured this iconic poster that so many of us growing up remember. Here's what they said. Although proto-apes and apes were quadrupedal, which means walking on all fours, are all shown standing for the purpose of comparison, they admit that this might be a little bit short of proof because it is based on fragmentary evidence, fossil evidence. But even though it's fragmentary, and even though they didn't really walk this way, it is an iconic picture, especially for those who believe that's where their family may have come from. There was a Harris poll taken on human origins, and they asked this question of Americans: do you believe that humans evolved from lower animals? Well, in 1994, 44% of Americans said yes, 46% said no. But in 2005, just 10 years later, only 38% thought that they had evolved from animals, and 54% said absolutely not. There is a transition in American belief. Charles Darwin, in his book on the origins of species, published in 1855, didn't exactly address where people came from. He talked about evolution in the animal kingdom, but he really hadn't given a lot of consideration to what he would have thought could have been a potential theory for where mankind came from. So in 1871, he published another book. The Simiadae then branched off into two great stems, the New World and Old World monkeys, and from the later, at a remote period, man, the wonder and glory of the universe, proceeded. Of course, he got a little bit of pushback in 1871, but some of what helped him were some of the recent discoveries that were taking place in various areas of the world, particularly in that valley in Germany, where it was called the Neander Valley, and Tal in German is valley, so Neanderthal is where where people had found some bones, and they presumed that this was from a separate but earlier race of men. So by the year 1856, just 3 years prior to Darwin's Origin of Species, they were already talking about a Neanderthal man. So one can see the origins of the traditional images that they thought caveman looked like, but as more bones were found, they began to change the image. The first bones that were found in the 1800s is what they had used to imagine what a Neanderthal man would have looked like. And there's the skeleton when they finally put them together. Now we've got more than 400 of them, and different artists, depending on who was trying to draw the picture, has come up with multiple different ways of looking at what this Neanderthal looked like, from very human to, well, almost very ape-like. One of them even came up with a wonderful rendition of a nice red-haired, green-eyed young man. And so you can see that even the pictures of Neanderthals have evolved. It's, I would say, pardon the pun, but it's true. According to this article in the Science Digest, the vast majority of artist conceptions of these ancient humans are based more on imagination than evidence. What can you tell from bones? Some, but not everything. Artists must create someone between an ape and a human being, and the older the specimen is said to be, the more ape-like it had to be. So they were actually starting to create their own set of rules on how to create the drawings. So back to the Neanderthals. And they found that these Neanderthals buried their dead. They played musical instruments, cooked over fire, painted scenes on cave walls, and they even had larger brains than we did. Given what we use of ours, I'm not sure it made a difference. Neanderthals were very human. So let's go to a discovery some years ago by the Leakey family. And you may remember this down in Tanzania in the Olduvai Gorge. And their discoveries filled the National Geographics for a few years. They called them Zinjanthropus, and also had a number of artist renderings of what this creature looked like. And they were pretty sure that it was either an ancient man or could it have been just an extinct ape. Zinjanthropus also has a number of these artist renderings. Don Johnson discovered Lucy in Tanzania in '74, and he was actually looking for an ancestor of human beings. He thought this might be a possibility, and so using the few bones that he had found, they were reconstructed to appear as though it was a full, straight up and down person. Even though she had a very ape-like head, her posture was very modern, and the scientific name for Lucy is Australopithecus africanus. You may have heard that one in your science books. And she was thought to be about 3.2 million years old. So was she a human ancestor? Well, look at another evolutionist had to say about Lucy. Lucy had curved toes and fingers, a locking wrist, which was used for knuckle locking, a big toe that pointed outward, and long arms. There was no vocal cords or inner ear structure like humans have for balanced walking. These were all consistent with a tree-dwelling ape. And some monkeys can walk on branches of trees. So it's interesting that during this time of the discovery of Lucy, nearby in some footprints of volcanic ash that had now turned to stone, they found an adult and a child walking side by side from some earlier eruption. The problem was that these were very human-looking feet, and the age was dated to about 3.7 million years. So using the potassium-argon method, it actually came up with footprints of real humans that were older than Lucy. Now this created a real problem. If the footprints were not known to be old, we would readily conclude they were made by a member of our species. And that created a new problem for them, because some of the people that they were dating, quote-unquote, early specimens, actually didn't appear to be as old as what human footprints did when they found the fossils of those. So then they found Artie. Artie is short for Ardipithecus ramidus. And also in Africa, these remains were thought to be even older than Lucy, 4.4 million years old. That's an excellent candidate for a human being. And some of the features of this skeleton were very promising. It had long arms and feet and seemed awful ape-like. So here's what another evolutionist evolutionists said, this is a fascinating skeleton, but based on what they present, the evidence for bipedality, that is walking on 2 feet, is limited at best. Divergent big toes are associated with grasping, and this one has one of the most divergent big toes you can imagine. Why would an animal fully adapted to support its weight on its 4 limbs in the trees elect to walk bipedally on the ground? So again, we keep finding that as they would come up with what they believed might be predecessors to the human race, there were always problems presenting itself, as well as in some cases, not very much evidence of how many of such skeletons they could find. So was it a human or wasn't it? Here's what Lord Sully Zuckerman said. We then moved right off the register of objective truth into these fields of presumed biological science like extrasensory perception or the interpretation of man's fossil history, where to the faithful of that scientific community, anything is possible. And where the ardent believer is sometimes able to believe several contradictory things at once. Notice what Richard Lewontin, we quoted him in the last seminar, all the fossils which have been dug up and are claimed to be the ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they are or not. All you've got is Homo sapiens there, and you've got that fossil there, and another fossil there, and then it's up to you to draw the lines. Because there are no lines. They cannot find connecting evidence. Now, this hasn't stopped a variety of drawings being made, and people actually coming up with different lines to connect all of the different ones. The main problem is in reconstructing the origins of man is the lack of fossil evidence. All there is could be displayed on a dinner table. Now that is a little bit older quote because now they have found enough evidence that it would take several dinner tables. So they are getting a few more samples, but unfortunately, the generations of students of human evolution, including myself, have been flailing about in the dark that our database is too sparse, too slippery for it to be able to mold our theories. Rather, the theories are more statements about us and ideology than about the past. Paleoanthropology reveals more about how humans view themselves than it does about how humans came about. But is that heresy? Well, it is, really, if you are a scientific model looking for scientific evidence. This is creating some problems for them. Evolutionist Dr. Bernard Wood said, even with all the fossil evidence and analytical techniques from the past 50 years, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains elusive. So I'm going to put up here on the screen all the basic candidates for human ancestry and see if they appear to fit in a human basket of one kind or another. Are they clearly apes or what? Homo sapiens are on the one side, and Pithecines, the apes, on the other side, and then there's a little bucket there in the middle we could call a muddle. So let's start. Neanderthal clearly was human. Artie, as we saw, was clearly an ape. Denisovan, clearly human. Habilis fits in the muddle. And so we go through each one of these and find that it is very difficult to find a link. According to evolutionist Ian Tattersall, quoted in his book, Contested Bones, or an interesting book, even allowing for the poor record we have of our close extinct kin, Homo sapiens appear as distinctive and unprecedented. There is certainly no evidence to support the notion that we gradually became who we inherently are over an extended period. Probably on the subject of human ancestry, One of the greatest stories in American folklore was the Scopes trial, famous monkey trial that took place in 1925. Happened in Dayton, Tennessee, where a state law had been enacted called the Butler Act. It prohibited the teaching of human evolution in schools, and there was a feeling that it was anti-religion teaching. And so they absolutely forbade it in this new law. About the same time, there was an organization coming along that you may have heard of called the ACLU. And the ACLU thought this was the perfect opportunity to make a name for themselves, and so they challenged the new law. And they were looking for somebody who would be a volunteer to go teach and then get arrested. And then they said, you know what, we'll defend you in court, but it'll give us an opportunity to bring this law to court. Clarence Darrow was a nationally famous defense lawyer. He catered to the elite of the day. And he was going to take the case for the ACLU, and so it became quite a show. The prosecuting attorney was William Jennings Bryan, a powerful public speaker, politician, and he was also a Christian. On top of that, for the first time, it was nationally broadcast over that newfangled technology called radio. And so it became quite the drama. Everybody tuned in to see what was going to happen. Clarence Darrow began to question William Jennings Bryan. He actually tricked him into going first, saying, if you testify first, then I'll let you ask me questions second. So he did. He got him up there on the stand, and he began to ask questions of Bryan and challenge him. And Bryan found that he did not know his Bible quite as well as he thought he did. Plus, he really hadn't considered some of those great creation issues. And by the time Darrow was done with him, he looked pretty foolish. Well, about this time, Clarence Darrow realized that he might have to go on the stand himself, and he was a little bit afraid of how foolish he was going to look, because he didn't know much about the Bible either. So they pled guilty. John Scopes was convicted of breaking the law, had a $100 fine. It was later overturned on a technicality. But two things came from this. Number one, ACLU got incredible national publicity, became quite a force afterwards, defending the rights of people about what they would say or not say, freedom of speech. Number two, creationism took a pretty good hit publicly because of all the questions that Bryan just couldn't answer. Well, the book that John Scopes used was called A Civic Biology. This was the textbook that they were using. By the way, here's something very interesting about those textbooks. I'm glad we've got newer ones. There was a chapter on evolution in there, and the quote was telling both for its time and for what evolution taught. At the present time, it said, there exists upon the earth 5 races or varieties of men, and finally the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. This book was promoting racism. No question about it. It said that white people were better than anyone else. And actually, if you go back to Darwin's book, he believed the same. In The Origin of Species, he was saying the preservation of favored races. So not all races, but all human races. And at that time, the British were running the planet. And so here's what he said from his book, The Descent of Man. From the old books, he said this. He said, that's why we Brits are running the planet. We're the fittest. And so nature is favoring us. You can see where this is going, right? Evolution came up with some strange theories. At some future period, Darwin said, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, and instead of now, between the Negro and the gorilla. Darwin was against slavery, but he also believed that the white race was superior in every possible respect. Here he said about genders, too. This will make the ladies happy. The chief distinction in intellectual powers of the two sexes sexes is shown by man's attaining to higher eminence in whatever he takes up than it can a woman. Whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of senses and hands, man has ultimately become superior to women. So I want all the men to give me a show of hands of how many of you believe that. Oh, yeah, John, I figured you weren't going to do that. Darwin's personality, although he was reasonably genteel compared to his friend Thomas Huxley, he was Darwin's bulldog. And this is what he said in Emancipation, Black and White, in 1865. He was referring to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of just a couple years earlier. He said, it might be quite true that some Negroes are better than white men, but no rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is equal, still less superior to the white man. What a problem for evolutionists, at least at that time. So here's what Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard biologist, famous evolutionist, said about the subject of racism. Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by order of magnitude following the acceptance of the evolutionary theory. The litany is familiar, cold, dispassionate, objective. Modern science shows us that races can be ranked on a scale of superiority. This was quoting some of these early evolutionists. Charles Darwin's cousin was the pioneer in a study called eugenics. How many remember that? It was very popular here a few years back. Or good genes. And this was a study of human-engineered evolution, whose goal was to eliminate the weaker elements of the human race. In other words, don't let them populate the world. And then there were some who became famous for other things as well, like Adolf Hitler, who very much appreciated Charles Darwin and Francis Galton's view, and totally believed that the way to improve the human race was to get rid of the inferior races in the world. And we certainly remember what that ended up becoming. This is the enduring image of evolution that goes all the way back to, well, we have a picture of the soup if we went far enough to the left, that primordial soup. But this is how it was supposed that man evolved. And the Scopes trial succeeded in bringing all kinds of these images and issues to the heartland of America. So let's take a look at a video here on the debate of human origins.
Today we are in Dayton, Tennessee, in a courthouse where a very famous trial took place nearly 100 years ago. And it all had to do with the great question of where did humankind come from? We had evolution presented, we had special creation presented. And those opposing opinions were clearly the focus for that trial. In America, we're still talking about that today. Where did man come from?
The Scopes monkey trial is an interesting event in American history. Probably has been distorted a great deal, especially in things like the movie Inherit the Wind. But what I think happened there was the evolutionary side was presented publicly and not scandalously, which it might have been considered previously. But it was given an airing. It is said that ideas start out first as a heresy, and then with acceptance, and then finally everybody knew it all the time. The stage is an acceptance of a theory. But in order to reach that, it first has to be aired out. And I think the Scopes trial probably gave the evolutionary viewpoint the publicity that eventually resulted in its acceptance.
The long-term effects of the Scopes trial are big, much bigger than you might expect for a trial that a lot of people have never even heard of. The initial change is really not much. sort of a drawback away from the anti-evolution crusade of the 20s. So when the ACLU took the case of Scopes to the Tennessee Supreme Court overruled it on a technicality because of the judge setting the fine instead of the jury, which was supposed to happen. And so the Tennessee Supreme Court made it clear, we don't want to see any more of these cases. And so that was the end of that. And the culture, sort of conservative Protestant Christianity, they turned more towards liquor and the Prohibition crusades of the 20s. And so it was largely, in some sense, forgotten. At the same time, the textbook publishers decided that evolution was a hot-button issue that they really didn't want to mess with. They did not want to risk some sort of big campaign that got their textbooks dropped, because they made a lot of money selling textbooks. So they decided the best thing to do was to simply, as much as they could, excise references to evolution from their textbooks. In the meantime, over in the world of science, you have the birth of what is now known as the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So the difficulty with Darwin's origin was that he really didn't understand how inheritance worked. And no one did. And it wasn't really until the turn of the 20th century that people began to rediscover and uncover the principles of genetics that govern how traits are passed along. And it took another 30 years before statisticians came along and started working out what that would mean in populations over time, and how natural selection could actually work in those circumstances. And that birthed what we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which then took time to work its way through the scientific world. And then, once it was finally generally accepted by the scientific world, then the scientists sort of looked around and said, we've all come to a conclusion about evolution, but it's not in the textbooks. The textbooks don't even mention evolution, which was crazy. So at the Darwin Centennial at the University of Chicago in 1959, the call came out that we need to change our textbooks. It just needs to happen. And so along comes the 1960s, and the textbooks do a complete 180. Instead of not mentioning evolution at all, they go to make evolution the unifying theme of biology, and including these, outrageous claims like Dobzhansky's "nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So parents who grew up in the 40s and 50s and learned biology from textbooks that barely mentioned evolution now had kids coming home telling them that, well, nobody believes in creation anymore. Everybody thinks evolution is true, and it's just obvious. So there was a bit of a cultural crisis, you might say. At the same time, you have Henry Morris and James Whitcomb working on The Genesis Blood, which comes out in 1961, and it becomes, in a very real sense, sort of the rallying point for the reaction to evolution. They provided an alternative way to understand the fossil record, to understand what fossils were, to understand comparative anatomy, and all the stuff that goes into evolution. It gets wrapped into Whitcomb and Morris's ideas in their book. So it's a recipe for confrontation, right? You have a public that is generally ignorant of evolution, didn't know anything about it. You have a scientific world who has decided this is evolution, this is how it works, and you need to learn it, so we're going to put it in the textbooks. And then you have the creationist, the Genesis Blood from Whitcomb and Morris, that becomes this rallying cry, rallying point. And so, of course, there's going to be conflict. So in the 70s, you have the beginnings of the trials. In the 80s, you have the Arkansas trial and the Louisiana trial, where creation is basically ruled out of the courtroom. And it's a really weird circumstance, because in the Scopes trial, Darrow and the defense were arguing for equal access of creation and evolution so that the kids could make up their own mind. where Brian is trying to kick them out and keep only creation in the classroom. In the 80s, the trials were basically reversed. The evolutionists were working to kick out creation from the classrooms, and the creationists were arguing for equal time and equal treatment. Very bizarre history, but there it is. I mean, that's in a nutshell the long-term impact of what the Scopes trial brought to us.
Well, the biblical view of origin is so exciting. It's so wonderful, and it's so logical and beautiful. God did it in 6 days, and it specifies what he did on each day. And at the end of many of what he did on each day, it says, and it was so. I love that. It was so. God knows that we kind of may doubt and wonder. And it reminds me of John 14, verse 2, where it says, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. So I think we can put right back down there in the Bible, every time it says, and it was so, we can add, parentheses, if it were not so, I would have told you. And think about this, when he made us in his image, what beauty and value that does to the human being. And we should treat one another, and we should act like the image of God.
When it comes to educating our young people on questions of origins, I do think it's important to present both views. They need to have a strong foundation in the Bible and creation science. But they also need to know at least the basics of what are being taught in the public sector from evolutionists. Because once they get outside of the church and they hear some outside opinions or data, and they have no way to compare that to what they've been taught, that can start to erode their faith. Not only in what they've been taught, but everything, their foundation. So I think they need to be prepared for what they're going to encounter in the secular world. And there's some great books available, lots of great resources for how to teach both sides.
So the debate continues. It was not settled in this courtroom nearly 100 years ago. It's still going on today. But for more information, let's now take a look away from science and take a look at God's Word and see what good news we can find out about human origins there.
So when we look at this world, we see evidence of incredible complexity. When you look at all of the animals and the birds, and anyone who loves the journal Nature, it's just always amazing. But where is man in all this? Simply another animal, or was really the Genesis story true? Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. So God created man according to the Bible story in Genesis, and then said it's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. So Adam gave names to all the cattle, to the birds of the air, to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him. You saw all the animals coming 2 by 2, and giving each one its name, but there was nothing for Adam. Then the day came when he was introduced to someone more similar. Then the rib which the Lord God took from man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to man. Here's Jesus, the creator of all things, bringing to Adam now his wife. There's something very interesting about this in the original Hebrew. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I'm going by the script on this one. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken from man." A female seminary professor, an expert Hebrew, said this: "The Hebrew is not very well translated in this verse. Instead of 'this is now bone of my bone,' the first words out of Adam's mouth could better have been translated, did I not forward my pictures for a while? Let's go back here. There it is. Wow. Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Gentlemen, that's what we've been saying ever since. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. That is a much better story. This is how he made us. Sexual dimorphism. That's a mouthful. Genders having different forms. The fact that it requires two for genetic offspring. Wouldn't it have been, based on the evolutionary theory, far more efficient to just have one? Why have two? Because it appears that God created us for something more, for companionship. God made mankind in his own image because he created us for fellowship. He created us to give us the power to create life in our own image. He appointed us to be rulers over the world, stewards, if you want to use that word. I'm sure we've not done as good a job as we could have taking care of the planet or the story. And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Now forming man is a very intimate process with the Creator, who has been so involved with life on this planet. So why did God want to create man this way? I think it illustrates that God desires very much to be a part of our lives. He didn't just leave us here. I know back in the early days of the founding of this country, there was a branch of quote-unquote theologians called deists. Many of our founding fathers, or several of our founding fathers, were deists. They had this idea that God kind of wound up the clock and then left, and just left us to our own devices. But how much better is this, where Adam opens his eyes for the first time and looks up at his Creator, who says, "Hello, I just made you. I'm going to call you Adam." I'm sure Adam had some questions when he was looking up in God's face. But this was intended to be a fellowship between God and man. He never intended for us to be separate from him. And when we think about that, we can think of what the psalmist says. "I praise you for this body." "I praise you for this body. It is incredibly and wonderfully made. Your whole creation is a marvel, and I know that it all didn't just happen. You saw my unformed body inside the womb. You knew how long I would live, even before I was born. How tender your thoughts have been toward me, O Lord. If I wanted to count the times you thought of me, it would be like counting the sand on the seashore." And as for how many races, well, there's really only one race according to the Bible. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying out, Abba, Father, Daddy, Dad. What a way, an intimate way to communicate with the Creator of the universe. It places us in a completely different perspective than what the secular world has done to just leave us as a bunch of people in a conflict to survive. It prices us as the offspring of God, as one who He created. He called us His Son. When you look at the genealogies in the Gospel, it says the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, who was the Son of God. And that, my friends, tells us a lot more about our genealogy than any science book you could ever read. So thank you very much for being here. I hope you come back tomorrow night. We're going to look at oceans, the story of the flood, and dinosaurs.